Hello and welcome to 10 more traps that win chess games. The previous video on this channel, which was the 100th video for this Nick Butts chess channel, featured 10 chess traps that win chess games. And so here are 10 more traps that win chess games. And so let's begin here. In this example, e4 is played, e5, and then d4. So this is not a very common opening. Normally, knight to f3 would be played. But in this example, d4 is played. And then after capture, instead of capturing with the queen, the knight is developed here. And then after this, check by the bishop, we have a block, capture, driving the bishop away, and the bishop retreats, keeping an eye on this f2 pawn here. And white does the same, moving bishop to c4, eyeing the f7 pawn. And after d5, here, black tries to slow down white, who is aiming at this f7 pawn, which could spell trouble for black. And then after capture, the bishop moves here to help guard. But we have bishop to g5. Now the queen is under attack and moves. But we have this move, a capture, forking the queen and the king. And so here, black is lost. If black does not capture with the king, which would result in a fork between the king and the queen, we have mate in 3 or mate in 1. And so here first we'll look at this move. If the king captures, then we have knight to e5, just forking the king and the queen here. And so there's nothing left for black to do. The king could move, but then we would have a capture of the queen with check. And so after capture, white is clearly ahead here. And so if we go back to that position, after this capture, anything else would lead to mate, as you can see here. A mate in 1, if the queen captures here, then we have queen to d8 mate. So that's interesting. We could play that out and then mate here. And the other mate in 3 was if the king moved here, then we have queen check, the king moves and captures, but then we have knight to e5, and after the king moving to the only square available here, we would have queen to d5 with mate. And so this was an interesting little crazy variation that happened. And this opening, which is not played as often, if I go back to the beginning here, with this d4 move, the center game. So that's something maybe you could play in a blitz game. Okay, let's move on to example number 2. And as the computer loads, okay, we have e4, e5. Once again, the center game, capture, and here with this move we have the Danish gambit. And so after a capture, bishop to c4, and here white tempts black to capture even further by capturing on b2, and then the bishop could capture, but then white would have these two bishops lined up on the king side, and black has no pieces developed yet, so that could spell trouble for black. And so black instead develops the bishop, threatening a capture with check here. And then after the pawn captures, it could threaten to capture and take the rook and become a queen as well. And so capture here, driving this bishop back. And so here's the mistake that black made. He retreats back, and in the game, if we go back after this capture attacking the bishop, if bishop to c5 were played, well, then we have this move, capture, and if the king captures, then queen checks and recaptures here after the king moves. I don't know, we have these moves, and here white is slightly ahead. So that is one possibility how the game could have played out. But in the game, after this retreat back to e7, now white is even further ahead with this queen to d5 move, threatening to checkmate here on f7. And here, this move leaves a gap for the king to escape to, but black is just in trouble here. And if knight to h6 is played, then the bishop could just capture and still have this threat here of mate. And so in the game, d6 was played, and then check, retreat by the king, but then a check here, which is interesting, as now the king can retreat back up to e8, but then we have check by the bishop now. And so after the king moves here, it's only a choice. We have a discovered check after the bishop moves away, and then if we have the block here, then a capture of this bishop here. And so in this position, white is ahead quite a bit here and shouldn't have any problem winning this game. All right, let's go on to the third trap here. All right, and as that loads, okay, in this position, e4, e5, one more of these center games, although this turns into the Danish gambit here. So after capture, bishop moves, and here we see this accepted additional capture here on b2, which allows the bishop to recapture, and now we have these bishops lined up on the king side. So black is ahead in material here, so basically ahead 2 pawns, but white has developed both of his bishops and they are aimed at the king side. So we'll see what black does here. After a check and the king moves out of check, we have knight to f6, e5 attacking this knight, and here the attack on the knight is ignored and d5 now attacks this bishop. But the bishop just moves here, checking the king. And so in the game, it looks like if knight at f to d7 was played, which that was not played in the game, but if this move was played, it appears that black would have been okay. But in the game, we had bishop to d7 played. And so after queen to a4, here white is okay in this position as this bishop is under attack, and he is covering this bishop. And so in this position, white should not have any issues. He's also attacking this knight here. So the computer wants bishop to e7. And so let's see how that would play out. After capture, and then capture, let's see, we have this, and I'm just curious how this would play out. And after knight captures, and so once again, this looks like, I don't know how much of a trap it was. It didn't really put white ahead, but it did keep the game even. And so here it recommends, well, this is interesting. It's recommending knight to d2 here, which would leave this bishop under attack. So that is interesting. Well, might as well. Also, it recommends this, retreating back. So I would say this game, I'm sorry that wasn't as much of a winning trap, but it looks like there were a few little traps where white was able to stay even with black here, although now he's ahead in material. Let's see, 3 pawns, so it's about even material wise, 3 pawns for a piece. Well, that one, feel free to try that one out on your own, test it out over the board and look at it, and if you have any comments, let me know. So that one turned out a little different as I played it further. All right, let's just move on to the next one here, number 4. And as it loads, okay, so e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6. So here we have the Scotch game. And after capture, this has changed into the Goring Gambit variation of the Scotch game. Instead of capturing in the center here, we have this c3 move. And then after capture, now white has both knights developed by giving up that pawn. And after bishop to c5, we have development by white, the queen and the bishop lining up with a battery on this f7 pawn. And so the queen moves here to help cover that. But now we have this knight jumping into this outpost on d5 here. And it is showing that black is ahead in this position, so that's interesting, but not much for having a full extra pawn. And so after this move, we have queen to c3, and then capture of the bishop. But this allows queen to capture on g7 here, and now white has jumped ahead. And after a queen move here, threatening a check and possible capture here, and attacking the queen, but the queen could capture here on a8, which is what white did. So capture, and now a counter capture here, attacking this rook. But after a check here, capture and attacking the queen, we have queen capture and knight to f6. And so white should win here, forking the king and queen. And so this may play out with the king moving to cover this. So after capture, capture, and then here the computer recommends a development of this bishop here to h6. So that's interesting. That would leave this pawn unprotected. Also, the computer, the second recommendation is b3, which that would probably be decent. Chase this knight away. But anyway, white is ahead here after that little trappy maneuver. And so maybe try that out on your own and see what you think of it. All right, let's move on to trap number 5. And I'll try to speed this up a little bit as we are only on 5 and we have 11 actually. I threw in a bonus trap on this one as well as the previous video. We had 11 instead of 10 as advertised. Okay, so e4, e5, knight to f3, and here once again the Scotch game. And after capture, this is the Scotch gambit, where the recapture is not done here. So the knight in the normal Scotch game would recapture here, but in this Scotch gambit, bishop to c4 is played, and then we have this move attacking the bishop. And so here we have a sacrifice, capturing on f7, and if the king captures, then we have knight to e5 with check. And after the king moving into the center of the board, we have a capture with the queen, and now this attack on the queen and the knight at the same time. And then we have d5, and already here black is in a lot of trouble as there's a mate in 5, and so the game continued with the king retreating, and here we have a check forcing the king down into the middle of the board, and then after check the king captures the pawn, another check, and so black is just in trouble here as he moves to inevitable mate with queen to d5 and mate. And so that was a little tricky line that black fell into, and so feel free to play these lines out yourself, see what you think. Obviously some of the best moves were not played, but it just shows you how these open games that trade the pawns in the center and leave plenty of room for the pieces to attack all over the board, they can become pretty chaotic, and if you're not careful watching the tactics, it's easy to just fall in trouble and fall into these traps. All right, let's move on to trap number 6. And so we have, and it'll take a second to load up here. All right, e4, e5, knight to f3, and once again the Scotch game and the Scotch gambit. And here black plays a little differently, overprotecting this pawn, now trying to keep it. And this is an interesting move. So the knight jumps up here, and with the bishop eyeing this f7 pawn. And knight to h6 protecting the f7 pawn. But now we have the queen jumping into the game here. And so here we even look at the computer evaluation. If black would just move queen to e7, it shows that the game would be in his favor. But in this game, knight to e5 was played, trying to add extra protection here. And then we have this move, knight to e6. And so here we see that the evaluation has jumped in white's favor, plus 1.3. And whatever black does here, he'll be in trouble. Queen to f6 is the recommended move. And then knight to c7 would fork the king and the rook. And so if this knight was captured with d takes e6, we would have one move for white, capturing on e5, and so that keeps white ahead. And then after the recommended move, bishop to b4, we have c3, and here queen to h4 is recommended. Interesting. So queen to h4, but already white is ahead in these lines, and after c takes b4, that's interesting that he would just leave that bishop to be captured, but that's what the computer recommended. Oh, okay, I see what is happening here. Another little trap. Queen captures, king captures, knight to g4, forking the king and queen, and then after the king moves, which the computer recommends that move, then we would have a capture, and now the bishop is under attack. So after that move, we have d3, and this is interesting to play this out, but the computer does show that after bishop to f4, looks like it is what it wants, but I don't know, white has options here. Anyway, in this position, it looks like white is ahead, but there were a few little traps in that variation. All right, let me move along here to trap number 7. Okay, in this trap we have e4, e5, d4, once again the Scotch game, and after capture, and here is the normal Scotch game main variation here, where the pawn is immediately captured by the knight, and after an attack on this knight, a bishop develops to protect the knight as it is being attacked by both knight and bishop. And now the queen adds more pressure on this knight, and so c3 further protecting, and now the queen moves here, attacking the e4 pawn, and also attacking g2, so that if the bishop moves away, there's an option of capturing on g2 as well. And so after queen to e2, there's a trap here, and the queen falls into this trap, capturing the pawn, and then after capture, the knight just remaneuvers down here, and this bishop is pinned to the queen. And so here the evaluation recommends knight to f6, but once again white is ahead here. And so that's another little trappy line in this Scotch game. And we see how these open games produce a lot of tactics, and after the pawns are traded in the center, there's just a lot of room for pieces to move and maneuver all over the board, and so some of them are quite tricky. And if you like tactics, jump into these games. You'll probably love them. But if you're a positional player, maybe not so much. All right, let's jump into number 8. Let's see here. Load it up. All right, the 8th trap. All right, in this line, e4, e5, and then bishop to c4, the bishop's opening, and both bishops are out, and then we have the c3 move, preparing to push forward to d4, and the knight tries to control the center, and we have the pawn push. But here black decides to try and control as much space as white, but this is where he will run into trouble with that move. We already see that this move was a mistake, as the game would play out. Capture. If the knight moves here to attack this bishop, we just have a capture of this bishop, capture, and then a queen check here. And there's nothing that can be done. The king is in check, the knight is under attack, and the evaluation shows that white is ahead and should win this game. All right, on to number 9. And it is loading. Okay, so here we go. E4, E5, a bishop's opening again, but now knight to F6 is played, attacking the pawn in the center. And so white just protects that pawn. And then here a passive move was played with bishop to E7. And so this probably contributes to the trouble that black finds himself in later in the game, as he plays a little bit passively. After capture, here E5, instead of recapturing with the bishop, E5 is played, driving this knight away. And so the knight retreats, and then we have development by white. This pawn is pushed forward, and so now the bishop is developed, capturing this pawn. Capture, ignoring this bishop, which is under attack. White moves to H5, threatening to capture the F7 pawn with check and drive the king into the middle of the board. And so then we have a block here by this pawn, capturing in the center with the queen and threatening this rook on H8. And so a block by the knight, but then we attack the knight here, and this knight develops to protect, but black is just in trouble here. After a fork of the king and the rook, the king moves away, but after check, the king moves once again. We have a sacrifice of the bishop, and after a capture, queen to E6 mate. And so that was another interesting line, and I invite you to take a look at these lines. You know, maybe the best moves weren't always played, but because there are so many tactics that are possible in these open games, especially in a blitz game, you can catch your opponent, especially if it's something that he's not used to, and he just, you know, is not sure what the best response is. All right, let's move on to number 10. Number 10. All right, so it is loading, and here we go. E4, E5. So here we have the Vienna game, and the pawn is pushed forward, attacking this central pawn with a side pawn. And after, instead of capturing, we have a fortification with this D6 pawn, fortifying the E pawn. And then the knight develops, putting more pressure on the center, and also keeping an eye on this H4 square in case the queen wants to check at some point later in the game. So here, this is played to prevent a pin by the bishop here, possibly on B5. So the bishop instead moves here to C4, eyeing this F7 pawn. And so that is a theme that recurs often in these open games, where the bishop and knights, they eye this weak F7 pawn, which is only protected by the king. And so that makes it a good target, because black is forced to bring in other pieces to help the king protect this pawn. And so a pin here, and after capture, capture, here knight takes e5. And we have a very famous trap here where if this was played, capturing the queen, black would think, oh, I have a free queen, but he would fall into this mating trap here with check, protected by this knight, so the king must move, and then we would have mate here. And so this famous mate, the black player was aware of that, and so instead of, after this knight capturing on e5, instead of capturing the queen, we have d takes e5, but then white goes ahead here, capturing on g4. And in this position, the evaluation gives almost +3 to white. And we see that white has 3 pieces developed and black has nothing developed. White is ready to castle here, and black's king is just stuck in the center. So here, white should have no problem winning this game from this position. All right, let's jump into the final, the bonus trap number 11 here. And as that loads, all right, so if you've hung around this long, I thank you. And here is the final trap. e4, e5, the king's gambit with f4 here. And so after this capture, the king's gambit accepted, we have bishop to c4, bishop to c5, d4. So this was not the best move here, perhaps, moving the bishop to c5, where this pawn can just move forward and chase it away. And so here, instead of retreating first, we have a check by this queen on h4. And so we can go back and look at what would have happened after bishop to c5 if this was played. Capture, king captures, the queen could check, and then after g6 we have this capture here, and then possibly h4, queen to f2. So that is one possible variation that could have played out, and even in this position white is ahead about half a pawn. But if we go back to the main line, we have, after bishop to c5, instead of capturing on f7, we have d4, chasing the bishop, but check is played first. And the king just moves. And then we have the bishop retreating, the knight to f3 attacking the queen. And so the queen retreats here. And this gives white time to capture. And now white has a commanding setup here in the center of the board where all his pieces are controlling the center. Both pawns are here. So white is ahead the equivalent of half a pawn in this position. And after the knight presses forward, we have castling. Now this bishop could, oh, excuse me, I take that back. The bishop cannot capture. The microphone was in my way, and I didn't see that the queen could just recapture there if the bishop captured on d4. Okay, so here we have this move attacking, threatening to pile up here on the f7 pawn once again. And so castling by black, but we see the evaluation immediately jumps in white's favor. So if we go back here, it looks like the best move for black was to play d5, and then it would be somewhat equal, slightly in white's favor. And we could take a quick look at that. If d5 is played, though, what does it recommend here? Then it just recommends e takes d5, and then after knight takes d5, then it just recommends queen to h5. So this is interesting. And then queen to f6, but the game would be a lot more equal, but slightly in white's favor. So if I go back after knight to g5, we see that black is spooked and tries to get to safety here by castling, but now we have queen to h5 once again, and 3 pieces are piling up on this pawn. And here, this looks to be another mistake, attacking this knight. Let's see here. If I go back, see what the computer recommends. Oh no, the computer recommends that as the main move that will keep black alive, but black will be behind in material. If the rook is moved, then we have a mate in 2. And if a6 is played, where it just ignores the possibility, well, we have this mate in 1 here. So obviously, h6 is played to prevent this mate on h7. And so after capture, the rook recaptures the queen. And then this is as far as the game went. We can play this out, but already white is just so far ahead. And we have another possibility. Instead of the rook capturing, if the king would have just moved, well, then it's even worse. Then we would have a queen sacrifice, followed by a bishop moving here with mate. And so it was just ugly in this line. Black played too passively, and white just pressed forward and demolished the king side, and this is the result. Well, I hope you enjoyed these 10 more traps plus 1 that win chess games. And please like and subscribe if you enjoy this video. Please feel free to leave comments or suggestions. And also, take a look at these traps and see what you can find in them. I tried to go through them quickly, so I'm sure I missed some things. And you can play back through them and see what you can find. But if you like tactics, try out these open games and see how you can do. Especially if you're good with these tactics, you can give people a lot of trouble in blitz games with some of this stuff. Alright, well, I hope you all have a great evening, and I will see you the next time. Thank you.